Hi, welcome back to Cubs and Culture for January 11th, 2018. Okay, in this section, first of all, I want to correct something I said. At the end of the last segment, I said classical westerns have moral clarity, but not moral complexity. What I meant to say was classical westerns have moral clarity, but not moral simplicity. Okay? Okay. So, now, at one point in this country, over half the films made were westerns, some form of western. So obviously, if you just stuck to those 5 plots or whatever, it would get very boring very, very quickly. Also, actually going to Monument Valley to shoot certain scenes would be expensive, and a studio wouldn't necessarily always do that. So there's ways of changing the classical form, which are superficial or not really a massive change. So, for example, you have a homestead story, like an empire story, where the story is about a person going to the California Gold Rush, and that would be a classical western. But if you just move it like 300 miles north and have it about the timber industry, then it's no longer a classical western, it's a northern western. Or to be a little bit more extreme and changing location, instead of telling an outlaw story about Jesse James, you tell an outlaw story about Ned Kelly, who was an Australian outlaw. And all of a sudden you have what's referred to as a meat pie western, because it's a western in Australia. You can also, instead of having like a sheriff story in 1878, you just have it in 1978, and then it becomes a contemporary western. Okay, so those sort of things are somewhat of artificial revisions or changes. It's still important that people can do that, and I'm just pointing out. Now, a more substantial revision to the classical form happened because of production. Okay, so way back in the day, if you didn't know this, you always got to see 2 movies. An A movie, which was sort of the movie you went to go see, and then a cheaply produced film called the B film. So most of the time, because again, like in 1942, something like 53% of all films made were westerns. Westerns were not classical western, but what's referred to as B-westerns were a lot of these films. Now, B-westerns not only had cheaper productions, but they also tended, because like they're B movies, they also tended to be lighter and somewhat gimmicky. So probably the best example of this, the other thing about B-westerns is they lack moral complexity. So they're morally simple and morally clear. You get sort of some of the stuff a lot of people think are what classical westerns are actually B-westerns. So this is where you get sort of the white hat, black hat thing, where the bad guy's in the black hat and he's a Snidely Whiplash type character, and the hero's a Dudley Do-Right type of figure, no real moral complexity. They were cheap. And then the other sort of thing is there's a lot of humor, slapsticky, a lot of light stuff. So Lone Ranger, the TV show from the 50s, is sort of like the good example. The other sort of major example of a B-western is there's an entire sub-genre of film called singing cowboy films. Roy Rogers and Gene Autry were sort of the main 2, where you had this the Carson City Kid is one of my one of my favorite singing cowboy films. Yes, there's like 150 of these things. Where it's sort of a very lighthearted outlaw story or a sheriff story, where the main character ends up having to only able to express his feelings through song. So there's always at least like 1 or 2 songs in it, sung by the main character. Roy Rogers and Gene Autry were the main guys. Tex Ritter was another one. Okay, so B-westerns, lighter, less moral complexity, cheaper, faster to make, goofier, Lone Ranger type stuff. So that's taking the classical form and making it more about entertainment, okay, or more about the lighter side of the Western genre, playing cowboys and Indians, okay. Then there's a whole series of other films called anti-westerns or revisionist westerns that take a sort of central element of classical westerns and flip it on its head. And these movies often end up with a lot of moral ambiguity. So let me kind of give a couple of good examples for anti-westerns. Okay, you have, so for example, in the classical western, in the Indian cavalry story, you always sided with the cavalry, where the Native Americans, first people, were not portrayed, racist, basically, racist stereotypes. And in the classical form, you always sympathized with the white settlers. So a revisionist western would, for this would be Dances with Wolves. Okay, the Best Picture winner from 93, 92. Because in that film, you end up not taking the cavalry side, you end up taking the first people's side. Okay? Or, for High Noon's a revisionist western, and so one of the things in westerns is rugged individual. So the sheriff is naturally alone, and he stands up to the outlaw because it's his job, and he doesn't really ask for help. And it's about the sheriff is a figure, or the hero's alone, and it's about one man against the evil of the world. Well, in High Noon, which is one of the very earliest anti-westerns or revisionist westerns, the plot is this. This is the villain's name. It just happens to be a coincidence. It's this this Miller. This give me a sec. This movie is about a sheriff who is on his wedding day has this criminal, and this is just a coincidence, but the criminal's name is Frank Miller. Yes, the comic book artist. Sort of my biggest problem with the film. Anyway, so the Frank Miller's coming to kill him, so it's a revenge story, so there's moral complexity in that. In revenge stories in the classical form, you're always supposed to take the side of the person having revenge, seeking revenge, and in High Noon, you're not supposed to. But the main sort of revision is the story is Gary Cooper, who's on his wedding day, keeps going around asking people for help because it's a gang and he needs help to survive. Because obviously one man against like four is not good odds. And then at the end of the film, spoilers, whatever, it's from 1954, his Quaker wife ends up saving his life. So it's one of the very first, earliest examples of sort of rugged masculinity within the Western context being undermined. It's also allegedly an allegory for the blacklisting in Hollywood around the comment of the Red Scare. That's not really what I care about, but the thing is, this movie's so upset Howard Hawks, he actually made Rio Bravo in response to it. Okay, so that's another sort of way in which you get revisionist westerns. Then you also get things like the Leone or spaghetti westerns, where that world is basically everyone in those worlds are after money, and so you don't you get a very sort of not moral clarity, but sort of an amoral darkness or grit to it. Okay, and so also in the sort of revisionist westerns, you start getting sort of changes in the shooting style. So Leone always had extreme close-ups, but sort of the main thing is in the darker films that things are literally darker or grittier, or there's more dirt. So like, again, going back to High Noon for a second, it's one of the first westerns where the cowboys weren't prettified. They were actually greasy and grimy. Okay? So that sort of, the B-westerns undermine sort of the moral complexity, so they become lighter and goofier, more entertaining, and there's humor, and there's sort of sidekicks, and the white hat, black hat, okay? And anti-westerns or revisionist westerns comment or undermine major conventions by flipping them on the head. So you take the side of first people. Or the other sort of thing in anti-Westerns is instead of getting lawlessness conquered by order, you end up just with cycles of violence. So like in the classical form, when you have a revenge story, the revenge is the restoration of justice, and at the end it's done. Okay? Order has been restored. In excuse me, the spaghetti Western, the revisionist form, it's only the beginning of a cycle of vendetta. Okay? So those are sort of the major revisions. Now, going back to Hell or High Water, I'm going to contend, and why I've spent all this time talking about these things, is Hell or High Water basically takes every single major element from the Western genre, every single sort of major type of film, and works it into it somehow. That's why I love this film so much. It's basically the entire Western genre at the same fucking time. It's a great film. Okay, I'll be back in a moment.